The story of Jim Brown and his son Dan, the most daring and successful counterfeiters the world has ever seen. Their old homestead, their thrilling exploits, and their daring schemes have been nearly forgotten. The Brown farm still stands in present-day Cuyahoga Falls, about 8 miles north of Akron. In the Cuyahoga Valley, near the ghost town of Hawkins, near the banks of the Cuyahoga River. The farm originally consisted of hundreds of acres of land. Standing at the front door of the old homestead, you could see a good portion of the valley. These well-known counterfeiters were at the height of their operations soon after the Ohio Canal was built in the 1820s, and traces of their work can still be found in the Cuyahoga Valley. One of these were the caves in which the counterfeiters worked during the cover of night. Thousands of dollars of counterfeit silver and crisp bills have been plowed up at various times all through the valley, and especially at Yellow Creek, now known as Botsum Trailhead. There was once an Old Yellow Tavern in Boston, owned by Jim Brown and his wife Lucy, where the old-fashioned MD gas station now sits. Jim, the king of all counterfeiters, would secretly meet in a little back room with well-dressed men who came from all parts of the United States and beyond. This meeting room had a fireplace and secret doors, and in the center was a circular table and chairs. On the floor, at the base of the table, a large circular stain made from tobacco juice spit. Here, in this room, they planned out some of the largest counterfeit schemes known to man. During Jim and Dan Brown's lifetime, things were vastly different from today. 200 years ago, Ohio was considered to be in the far west. It was an era of the stagecoach and steamboat. The building of the Ohio Canal was considered to be a great achievement, and when the first boat passed down the valley to Cleveland, there was music by brass bands and celebrations up and down the stretch of the canal. Jim Brown appeared upon the banks of the newly built canal and started the tavern at Boston, which was then a town of considerable importance. To its south, along the same valley, were the rivaling towns of Peninsula, Johnny Cake, Pancake, Yellow Creek, and Old Portage. The canal was full of boats traversing up and down through Ohio. Boston had a population of several hundred people, although Peninsula was larger. Pancake was a terror. Yellow Creek was the center of the universe, and Old Portage was making a frantic effort to secure the county courthouse against Akron and Cuyahoga Falls. Steamboats came up from the lake, and the cursing of the mule drivers pulling canal boats could be heard all hours of the day and night. The village stores along the canal did a thriving business, and there were regular old-fashioned dances every Thursday night, and the country boys and girls visited the big cities only on special occasions, such as to see a circus, to get their pictures taken, or to procure a marriage license. Money was plentiful, churches scarce, and fights numerous. It was during just such days as those that Jim, when seated at the front door of his tavern, conceived the disastrous idea of entering the counterfeiting business, which later led to scores of daring exploits, imprisonment, the loss of a tender, devoted wife, a tragic death, and a neglected grave. Brown was a man possessed of marvelous abilities, a magnificent physique, a genial winning disposition, and in his natural and acquired gifts, properly used, there can be no question but that his destiny would have been at least as great as the governor's chair. He stood fully 6 feet and 2 inches in his stocking feet and was as straight as an arrow. His eyes were deep-set and penetrating and attracted attention wherever he went. Long after Jim's death, there was a retired pioneer who grew up in the valley and recalled of his friend.
I tell you that old Jim Brown was the most remarkable man who ever lived in Ohio. He was the world's greatest counterfeiter, but it should be said of him that he never passed his bogus money on to his friends. I have often seen old Jim return from his successful trips. He always rode a horse, and never did he come back to his home in the valley without having his saddlebags filled with presents for his neighbors. These presents would consist of gold watches and chains, tobacco, cigars, and trinkets of all kinds. The children liked him, and in fact, we all liked him. No one knew when he was going away, but we all knew when he had returned. He was too smart for them all. By this, I mean he was too smart for all the slick city chaps who eventually began to dog his footsteps. As for his son, Dan, well, he was a chip from the old block, and he did up the entire West and then came home loaded down with good money. Poor fellow. He came home to die, and I was present when they buried him in the backyard. And I also saw the detectives dig him up to make sure that he was really dead.
One of the liveliest experiences perhaps the elder Brown ever had was soon after his marriage, and just previous to his embarking in the counterfeiting business. One day, as he was seated in front of his tavern at Boston, he was struck by lightning, and all of his clothing, and even his boots, were torn from his body. He was rendered unconscious, but, strange as it may appear, when he was again able to stand up, and that was but a few moments afterward, he turned to his friend and said,
"There is not a man on this earth who can lay me upon my back as quick as Jesus Christ."
His tattered boots and clothing were kept by his relatives for many years. Jim's counterfeiting soon became extensive, and a few years later he had a small array of loyal employees disposing of his money all over the East, North, and South. His son, Dan, later looked after the far West. Jim was arrested many times by county and state officials, but he always managed to escape. It was not long, however, until the United States government got after him, and then his downfall was rapid. Because he was a remarkable man, Brown was often released from various penitentiaries, and once, after caring for the inmates with cholera in prison, he was given a free pardon by President Taylor. To his friends, he often said,
"I'm not afraid of the laws of the county or even the state, but Uncle Sam will be too much for me."
He had wonderful powers of endurance and was clever in escaping from his pursuers. He could prove an alibi that would paralyze the shrewdest of detectives. One of his grand exploits was performed after he had negotiated a forged draft with a New England bank. By riding night and day, by means of a relay of swift horses, he made his way to Ohio and down in the Cuyahoga Valley to his home so quickly that when he was taken back to New England, the court decided that no living man could have reached Ohio in the time intervening between the time of committing the crime and B.S. arrival back to the Cuyahoga Valley. His charges were dropped. Another time after he had fleeced some Pittsburgh people, he rode from Pittsburgh to his home in the valley in a single night, and it was proven that he was seen the next morning chopping wood in front of his house. The most gigantic scheme ever conceived by Jim Brown was the time that astonished the entire civilized world. In the fall of 1831, Brown and his brightest comrades purchased a ship at New Orleans and prepared for an expedition to China. Nearly $2 million of spurious notes, worth over $70 million today, that had been made in the Cuyahoga Valley, and a large amount of apparatus for making more was placed on the boat with a vast store of merchandise. Brown intended to visit China and India for the purpose of purchasing teas and spices with his own money. He would have been successful had it not been for the fact he went ashore in New Orleans the night before he sailed and proceeded to paint the town red. His actions attracted attention, and when he returned to his ship to set sail for the East, he was arrested by a small army of officers and detectives, and his ship and everything on it was confiscated. After being released, Jim's remarkable exploits stopped, and he began to drink heavily, that ultimately caused his divorce and the loss of his friends. On December 9, 1865, Jim was riding up to his farm by a canal boat when he was hit by a lock beam and knocked headlong down into the bottom of the boat. He was taken to his home and died the next day. Jim's body was placed in a plain coffin and was carried in a spring wagon to his final resting place at the Boston Cemetery. Dan, Jim Brown's son, operated principally in the far west among the miners, all the way from Colorado to the Pacific coast. When his identity became known, he headed home to the Cuyahoga Valley. By the time he reached the old homestead, he had full-on consumption and died January 21, 1851, and no sooner had his body been lowered in a grave in the backyard of the farm than detectives began to arrive from San Francisco. They would not believe the story of his death until the grave was opened and the casket lid removed. Dan's body was later moved to Akron and buried in Glendale Cemetery.